Dictators have never been welcomed happily as they rule the state, considering themselves above the law. And when we talk about a dictator, Saddam Hussein automatically joins the party. In his tenure in power, he portrayed himself as Iraq's most powerful leader and a bold modernizer. Yet his brutal government was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. And that's why people call him a cruel leader. But Saddam was never as evil as the world has portrayed him. So in today's video, we're going to see the other side of Saddam Hussein. He received the key to the city of Detroit. After coming into power, Saddam received a gratitude letter from Reverend Jacob Yasso in Detroit. Yasso and his community of Chaldean Christians received a $250,000 gift from the dictator. Chaldeans are a Christian group that has its origins in what is now modern-day Iraq. Yasso was invited to Baghdad to meet with Saddam Hussein and his following. During his visit, he presented the Iraqi commander with a key to the city of Detroit, which had been given to him by then-Mayor Coleman Young. Hussein then donated an additional $200,000 to the church. Saddam's roots in an abusive childhood. Saddam Hussein was born in the district of Tikrit, north of Baghdad, in 1935. Most of his closest allies and those who assisted him in his butchery were also Tikritis. Subha, his mother, was a despotic figure in her own way. Saddam's mother had 3 kids from a previous marriage before becoming pregnant with Saddam. Saddam's father, a farmer, had abandoned the family before Saddam was even born, and Saddam then spread the fabricated claim that his father had perished in a car accident. Subha searched for a new spouse and came across Ibrahim Hassan, who was already married at the time. He might have married Subha as a second wife, but she refused to accept him as a member of her family, and as a result, she forced him to divorce his first wife. According to the CIA report, Hassan was a physically and verbally abusive stepfather. Like Charles Dickens's Fagin, he beat Saddam regularly and forced the youngster to steal for the family's sake. Even some sources claim that he ordered Saddam to commit his first murder. It was also alleged that Hassan would occasionally hit Saddam to wake him up, yelling epithets such as, "You son of a dog, I don't want you." Saddam Hussein was detained at an early age and placed in a prison camp. Khairallah Tulfa, his mother's brother who lived in a nearby village, took him in when he was 11 years old and helped him get by until he could return home. A biography of Saddam claims that his uncle and other relatives handed him a weapon and sent him out in a vehicle to Tikrit when he was in his late teens to fend for himself and raise his family. Iraq's brutal Ba'ath Party provided Saddam with a political platform. He attempted to assassinate Iraqi leader Abdel Karim Qasem when he was 24 years old. Qasem escaped the assassination attempt, but was killed by another assassin 4 years later in 1963. At that time, Saddam just kept on growing, and ultimately, he became the powerful leader of Iraq in 1979. Saddam saw a protracted insurgency as inevitable. Crediting Saddam for maintaining Iraq's integrity is a far cry from absolving him of any responsibility. However, the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Defendants of the Iraq War refer to Saddam Hussein's brutality and assert that the area is better off due to his departure from power, claiming that his removal may even have triggered the Arab Spring. After spending the 1990s intermittently bombing Iraq and imposing heavy sanctions, resulting in thousands of Iraqi fatalities, the American people were already poised to support military action. A decade and a half later, retaliation for the invasion, the most disastrous foreign policy blunder since the Vietnam War, has mostly been reduced to denouncing Baathification, the disbanding of the army, and other second-order concerns. Last days and brave Saddam. At the end of the day, Saddam recognized that the most crucial component in military victory was the warrior's spirit. Saddam believed that establishing ideological devotion to the Ba'athist cause in Iraq's soldiers was the most effective method of preparing them for war. Saddam informed his officers that Allah intended to embarrass the United States by bestowing his strongest personal skills on the Iraqis, who were otherwise materially disadvantaged. Because Saddam believed that the Ba'athist spirit of the Iraqi warrior was far superior to anything that American soldiers could bring to the battlefield, he failed to see the several variables that were weakening the foundation of his military success. Saddam Hussein and those around him only seemed to comprehend that they were in the midst of a catastrophic military loss after a long period of time. In the dying days of the government, the only significant acts that people in power appeared to be capable of taking were attempts to prevent the flow of negative news. To provide just one example, a Ministry of Defense communication congratulated subordinate units on their excellent performance. It cautioned all staff officers to avoid inflating the enemy's capabilities. However, Iraq's military forces had already been disintegrated or were on the verge of crumbling by that moment. As a result of the coalition's airstrikes, practically all corps and division headquarters had been destroyed. The ones that had survived had been rendered impotent by America's breakneck speed in its advance. Although some scattered Iraqi troops continued to fight, they were no longer linked to a cohesive military structure. On the other hand, Saddam began issuing instructions to deploy and maneuver forces that had long since vanished. Plans to have the Republican Guard infiltrate Baghdad and join forces with Saddam Fedayeen in preparing for urban combat occupied the majority of his time and attention. According to one of those there, Saddam met with his closest aides late the next day. It acknowledged that the army divisions were no longer capable of defending Baghdad, and that he would convene a conference with the Ba'ath regional commanders to enlist them in the ultimate defense of the government. A later meeting, held on the same day, resulted in a plan to partition Baghdad into 4 quadrants, but it was never implemented. Instead, Saddam placed committed Ba'ath Party veterans in the leadership of each area and tasked them with defending the city until the last drop of blood could be drained from their bodies. According to a report, a U.S. armored battalion had already taken control of Baghdad's airport by the time Saddam talked to his military officials. Meanwhile, another brigade of American armor was tearing up the perfectly groomed lawn in front of the city's central palace. At the same time, he debated the city's ultimate defensive strategy with his staff. For many months following the fall of Baghdad, several top Iraqi officials held in coalition custody held out hope that Iraq still retained weapons of mass destruction capability stashed away somewhere. In their interviews with Iraqi officials, the coalition learned that this belief was founded on the fact that the country had previously possessed and used weapons of mass destruction and might do so again. Given the nature of the Iraqi regime and the fact that so many Western governments believed such programs existed, compartmentalized weapons of mass destruction programs surely did exist. But even that couldn't help the Iraqi forces to protect Saddam's empire. And then, on the morning of the start of Eid al-Adha, on December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was hanged to death for committing crimes against humanity. The American soldiers who grieved for Saddam Hussein. The way Saddam spent his time as a prisoner with soldiers will always be remembered as one of the best parts of his life. When Saddam's body was being removed from the execution chamber, a crowd of people began to beat and spit on him in an uncontrollable frenzy. A group of around a dozen American troops stood nearby, and instead of participating in the celebration, they expressed grief first, followed by fury afterward. Finally, one soldier became so enraged that he flung himself into the crowd, only to be stopped by one of his comrades who intervened. Saddam Hussein's death in 2006 was perhaps most startling for one reason. The American troops who guarded him during his final weeks were sincerely saddened by his passing. Such sentiments appear to be generally shared among the young men who stood vigil over Saddam Hussein from his capture to the time of his death. These soldiers spent months conversing, playing chess, and smoking cigars with an elderly gentleman who bore little similarity to the ruthless dictator from the Axis of Evil legend, who was on trial for crimes against humanity. Nevertheless, several members of the Super 12, as they came to be known, had a real affection for their prisoner and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder following his death. The American soldiers who were assigned to protect him essentially shut away. They were not allowed to speak about their job. They spent most of their time either at Saddam's former palace where his prison cell was built, or in the strongly guarded courthouse where he was tried. Furthermore, Saddam Hussein had survived as Iraq's ruler for more than 30 years via intimidation, cunning, and occasional spurts of charm, making him a unique prisoner of war. Saddam cooperated with his guards after realizing that his actual adversary was President George W. Bush. He inquired about their families and girlfriends, and he then wrote poetry for them. They talked and traded stories, and the guards ultimately got enamored with the elderly gentleman. He appeared to be doing well with his deteriorating circumstances. At one point, many of them cleaned up a dilapidated chamber in the palace and converted it into a Saddam-friendly office, where he could spend hours reading, conducting mail, and recording entries in his journals. Saddam's literary abilities are typically disregarded, which is fair when considering someone responsible for horrendous killings, yet they relate to his conflicted personality. Although he was capable of horrible atrocities, his demeanor might sometimes be described as perfectly normal. By 2003, the guy who admired Dostoevsky and Naguib Mahfouz had withdrawn from the day-to-day operations of the federal government. Saddam had just finished sending his latest novel to Tariq Aziz for feedback when the Americans invaded, a decision that baffled Saddam. He made repeated requests for reading and writing materials after he was detained. And that was actually the end of Saddam's power, who ruled the country for almost 24 years. That's all for today's video. If you want to see more of such content, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an interesting video from us. Thanks for watching.